Kathleen Nolan, MD, MSL, Director for the High Peaks Catskill Mountainkeeper. Neil F. Woodworth, Executive Director, Adirondack Mountain Club. Ellen Weininger, Joseph Stelling, Environmental Campaign Organizer, NYPIRG. Welcome.
I'm going to start first, I guess.
Sure.
Thank you very much for holding this hearing and frankly, for the members of the Assembly and their staff for staying this long to hearing us all out. I'm going to mention a couple of numbers that you haven't heard yet today. And that is, when I checked this morning, the price of natural gas was $3.24 a thousand cubic feet. Now, the significance of that number is that that's about a third or a fourth of what you can make a profit on if you use high-volume horizontal hydraulic fracturing. So, frankly, what is happening is that drill rigs are moving out of Pennsylvania. They are moving into South Dakota and North Dakota. The energy industry has learned that it's more profitable to use hydraulic fracturing for bringing up $90 a barrel oil and far more expensive propane, wet gas, than it is dry gas methane. And so there is no compelling hurry to rush the education process, particularly on the health issues, because really this industry right now is moving west, and we're not in any grave jeopardy of this gas is going nowhere. And believe me, we're going to want this gas to be a lot more profitable before we take the risks that are inherent in high-volume hydraulic fracturing. Now, let me also say that I'm going to use another number, and that's 1 million acres. And 1 million acres is the amount of acreage that DEC directly has as skin in this game, because that's the figure that represents the state forests, reforestation areas, wildlife management areas that we all own in the state of New York, and that DEC, through a provision, and I will get to the regulatory provision now, if you look at parts 52.3 and 190.8 AG, you find that although DEC, much to their credit, and after a lot of lobbying by my organization, has prohibited any surface disturbance on state land. However, they have expressly allowed for themselves to basically lease state gas on that 1 million acres from adjoining private lands. And here's where the problem comes in. One, over the last 40 years, DEC has done a remarkable job in almost doubling the size of that protected area through conservation easements, through our 480 forest tax program, so that when you fly over, and I have flown extensively over Pennsylvania, and the pictures that we took and the films that we took over Pennsylvania's public lands helped convince DEC that they would never want fracking to occur on their lands themselves. Because you fly over Pennsylvania's state forests and even the Allegheny National Forest, and you see a scene of incredible. You've turned what was some of the most beautiful forests in the Northeast into industrial landscapes. And that is what could happen to the private lands. Because what's going to happen if DEC is allowed to lease these lands for state gas at $3.25 a thousand cubic feet, is that our state forests, including some of the ones Assemblyman Lifton in your area, are going to get ringed by oil and gas rigs around the periphery of the state land. Those state forests are essential for protecting the water supplies. Some of the most productive and largest aquifers in the state sit underneath those protected state lands, and the private lands that buffer them. Think of the state lands as the hole in the donut. with the private lands that DEC now wants to open to exploit. Now, let's go back to the issue of compulsory integration. It should be explained to you, if you don't already know, that DEC runs the compulsory integration process. Their attorneys prosecute the private landowners who are unwilling. It's their administrative judge that issues the order that takes, if you're an unwilling leasee, that takes your land and puts it into the spacing unit. As someone said before, the energy company or the drilling operator is allowed to design the drilling unit without any interference by DEC. If the state leases its land, just like that large landowner that somebody talked about earlier, if the state leases its land, automatically the driller, like a gerrymandered political district, can design the drilling units to include the state land to get up to the 60% threshold that he needs to force everybody else into the drilling unit without their consent and at a minimal financial return. That's not right, ladies and gentlemen. That is why the compulsory integration statute. And it's particularly not right if DEC has skin in the game, if the state is both the beneficiary of this compulsory integration process, it's the prosecutor, and it's the judge in the process. So it's very important that you have a hearing that looks into compulsory integration, because if the state is part of it, I think it violates the State Administrative Procedures Act, Mr. Levine, completely. Several major provisions of SAP are violated if the state is running the process and is also a beneficiary. Frankly, I think the attorneys involved have ethical problems if they're involved in that process. And finally, there's something in this whole process that you can do without the Senate. One of the things about 250,000 of those acres is that they lie in forest preserve counties. Now, in the Marcellus area, that's Sullivan, Delaware, Ulster, and Greene. And there's a lot of state forest land that is over Marcellus in those counties. But because they're in a forest preserve county, the state cannot lease that land without the legislature's consent. So because those state forests in particular are so critical to the Delaware and Susquehanna watersheds and ultimately to the city of New York's water supply, I'm going to, if any bill comes to you asking you to allow the state to sell gas rights on those Catskill Forest Preserve County state forests, veto it. Please veto it. Thank you very much for hearing me out.
Thank you. And if I could ask all of you again, and Neil at this point, if you could, to state your name for the record.
Oh, sure.
So the camera knows who you are.
I was trying for brevity. Neil Woodworth.
We appreciate that.
Neil Woodworth of the Adirondack Mountain Club, and our portfolio here is that for the state's hikers, paddlers, skiers, it's our beat and our responsibility is all public land throughout the state, and it's about 4 million acres.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good evening. I'm Kathleen Nolan. I'm a board-certified pediatrician and have fellowship training in epidemiology and clinical research design, and have worked as a bioethicist. I'm currently working for Catskill Mountainkeeper and serving as the director for the High Peaks in our office in Woodstock. These DEC regs, the task in them is for the DEC to eliminate or minimize the risks associated with fracking. I think it's clear that it's impossible to eliminate those risks, and I think it's increasingly becoming clear that it may be impossible to minimize those risks, at least if what you mean by minimize the risks is to reduce them to a minimal or an inconsequential level. And I think that is the goal that we should have. To reduce the risk, you need to define them and quantify them. You have to do that both with the risk and with your thresholds, what you're going to consider something that's an actionable level. And then you take those risks and your thresholds and you compare them with your hypothesized benefits. If you don't quantify equally on both sides of the equation, it's not fair and it's not science-based. When you have a industry and an activity where you're dealing with substantial and irremediable harms, it becomes particularly important to follow this process carefully and thoroughly. Now, I define substantial and irremediable harms as harms of major magnitude that cannot be avoided or repaired within the lifespan of those who are injured or actually killed. We therefore need to quantify fracking's risk using emerging data from other states, instead of risking the individuals and communities in New York as human bioassays for the individual cumulative and, as we've heard, synergistic effects of the various toxic materials associated with fracking: the hydrocarbons, surfactants, acids, salts, biocides, silica dust, heavy metals, radiation. Now, there are two places I want to focus on where we see these substantial and irremediable harms. Although the third, it would be climate change, which several people have talked about. But I want to talk about contamination of water primarily and a little bit in regard to air. And when you talk about contaminating water and air, those are linked to contamination of soils, plants, crops, wildlife, and people. With water, the main source of the contamination, as we've heard today, is the well casings. Analysis of data from well testing clearly shows that you can have contamination of aquifers that stretch nearly a mile. Yet in these regulations we see setbacks that are calling for 500 feet. If you are going to avoid cross-contamination, you have to protect that entire interconnected aquifer. It doesn't help you to protect 500 feet of it. The data that's available from well testing across the state could be introduced into the record, and site-specific regulations and permitting be based on that specific data. Now, it is possible that the DEC or the Department of Health has some new data on this that we don't know about. We have no way to know about it because it hasn't been presented to us, and I compliment and thank you for sending the letters saying that we can't adequately review these regulations if we don't have documents and research that might argue for a different standard. But I'm basing my comments on what has been provided to us, and we don't have any good reason to support a 500-foot setback. There's also this question I raised about the threshold. What level of risk would we be willing to take? Even if there has been some new technology developed that we haven't been informed about that would reduce the well casing failures, let's say to a level of, say, 2% over the entire life cycle of a well, far below anything we currently know about, which one of us would want to choose the 2 out of the 100 communities that would lose its water supply? The DEC needs to specify what levels it's operating on for thresholds if we're to evaluate whether they're doing an adequate job. Beyond that, I think there's also a risk here of deep water contamination. Now, every industry person I've ever spoken with has said to me that that's impossible, and one of them has actually ridiculed me for bringing this up. But theoretical research from Myers, which I cite for you, suggests that this is the case under high pressures, that you do force the fluids even deep underground, even a mile or more underground, through substantial distances, especially when you consider longer time frames, months, years, or decades. In addition, the Duke study, which is well known, is basically a case-controlled analysis that supports the Myers modeling. More recently than that, last December, just in this past month, 2 wells in Alberta, Canada, that were being fracked interconnected. The 2 wells were separated by almost 500 feet, and they were fracking almost a mile deep. The fracking fluid and formation fluid from the first well went down, went across, and came up, shooting out of the second well like the geyser onto neighboring lands and trees. Fortunately, the ground was frozen, and they were able to remove most of the spill without it seeping into the soil. But when you add that horizontal and vertical depth, that's really a piece of empiric data that calls into question the notion of the 500-foot setbacks for sure, and I think even calls into question the notion of the well spacing being adequate under the current regulations. These are bits of evidence that we have to pay attention to if we actually want to do the job right on this. Point is basically that interconnections underground are similar to, parallel, just like the connections that we see above ground, and they can be increased by natural or induced seismic activity. We know that this industry's activities itself induce seismic activity, both in the injection wells and in the fracking wells. They may not be measurable at the surface or noticeable at the surface, but you can measure them. And in the United Kingdom, there was a research study that confirmed that earthquakes were related to a fracking. They stopped the fracking and the earthquakes went away. Because of the depths of the drilling that we're doing and the inability to detect and reproduce and trace exact paths of subsurface fluid flow, we will likely never be able to remediate any water we allow to be contaminated by fracking. We won't know where it is. A very similar analysis could be applied to the situation with air contaminants, methane, hydrocarbons, radon, other toxic gases. The release of these gases is permitted under these regs, as you've heard today, for 2 days on a regular basis, and then basically whenever there is the industry claims a need. And there's no requirement for notifying anyone during that period, educating, and there's no methods built into these regulations for detecting where these contaminants have gone. A hallmark of public health is you contain. If you can't contain, then you have to detect and remove people from what you're releasing. We don't have baselines in epidemiology for rates of cancer, birth defects, pulmonary diseases, skin diseases, neurologic diseases, all of these expected harms from these contaminants, or certainly not at the level we should have to go forward with this industry. We also don't have data on potentially exposed individuals, and this could be required under regulations, that if there are individuals or communities that will be exposed, you could do pulmonary function testing, skin surveys, neurological and psychological testing, toxicologic testing of body fluids to document the baseline and then watch for changes that might be preclinical, because many of the conditions that are caused by this particular classes of toxicants develop over a long period of time. Other people have talked about looking at special populations. That should also be done. One thing I do want to say is that there's a potential for more damage in regions with pre-existing damage. So you'll sometimes hear, well, there's methane seeps and methane leaking in some of these communities anyway, and so it's not caused by the industry. If you take an area where there are already naturally occurring methane seeps and you fracture in that area, you will really release huge amounts, much more than you would in a originally pristine area. So those are areas to avoid. And similarly, areas that are previous Superfund sites, as some of the 5 southern tier counties that have been mentioned as potential starting regions for drilling, if they're Superfund sites, it's very difficult to sort out the etiology of any problems you do encounter, because they already have elevated rates of some of these markers. So I'll conclude by saying that one way to begin to get this kind of analysis that I brought into a short period of time into a much more structured analysis is to do the comprehensive health impact assessment. That's the gold standard. You make it open, rigorous, comprehensive, participatory, and these kind of considerations can be hashed out, and you can see a solidly based way to proceed or not. I urge New York State to conduct such a study independent of any pressure to promote immediate use of high-volume, horizontal fracturing, instead of pushing ahead with inadequate information and playing what amounts to Russian roulette with our irreplaceable natural resources and the lives and health of our citizens. I thank you for your work on that.
Thank you.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Ellen Weininger. I am actually registered to speak in a later panel, but I've been asked to deliver the testimony for Patricia Wood, the Executive Director of Grassroots Environmental Education. So this is Patricia Wood's testimony. Grassroots Environmental Education is an environmental health nonprofit with offices on Long Island and in Westchester County. As a science-based organization, we focus on educating both decision makers and the public about the links between environmental toxins and human health. Last year, we provided an extensive digest of independent science on high-volume hydraulic fracturing to every high-level decision maker in Albany and facilitated 2 meetings between the DEC, the DOH, and the governor's offices, and an impressive delegation of medical doctors and scientists who came to Albany to share their expertise on a wide variety of technical, environmental, and health issues related to fracking. And I just wanted to show you this is the actual digest, which many of you may have received yourselves. And this digest was also presented to officials at the DEC and at the DOH, and you should also be aware of the fact that that's going back to July of this past year, and none of this information, none of the independent scientific information in the digest is that was provided was factored into the DEC's proposed regulations. Also part of this testimony includes the summary report of the points of that meeting that I just mentioned, which was convened in Albany. Dr. David Brown, a highly regarded toxicologist who runs a public health clinic in Pennsylvania for victims of exposures to fracking activities, spoke gravely about the human suffering that they have witnessed. The regulations we have before us from the DEC show an alarming lack of understanding of the science, the technology limitations, and even more importantly, the potential pathways of harmful exposures to humans from fracking. I would like to refer to one section of the regulations to illustrate this point, Section 560.7 I and K, Waste Management and Reclamation, the last page of the document. It is a fact that the Marcellus Shale contains high levels of naturally occurring radioactive material. Fracking in this region will bring large amounts of waste materials containing radium-226 and radium-228 in both solid and liquid mediums to the surface, where it has the potential to become a significant public health hazard for thousands of years. This section stipulates that flowback water, production brine, and soil adjacent to the storage tanks must be tested for radiation so the DEC will know just how radioactive that material is. But then what? You can move it from one place to another, you can dilute it, but you can't really clean up radioactive material or render it harmless. If it was that easy, we wouldn't need special secured storage facilities for nuclear waste. A complete and thorough analysis of the potential environmental pathways for exposure of people to these radioactive materials is a prerequisite to any regulatory approval of activities involving their extraction, handling, transportation, and storage. So what is the DEC's plan for dealing with these materials that test positive for high levels of radiation? In this document, there is no plan. And more importantly, what about the drill cuttings and sludge that come up the wellbore, materials that have to be disposed of somehow? Why are they exempt from testing for radiation? And the proposed radiation surveys of the wellheads, piping, and flowback water and production brine tanks, what will they do when they test positive? Replace them? Where will the contaminated pipes and tanks go? Will the DEC allow drilling companies to just bury the radioactive material on site with no testing and no records, as they are doing in Pennsylvania? Will they allow trucks to carry this lethal, so-called residual waste or contaminated equipment over our public roads to designated dumping sites across New York State? When the EPA reviewed the DEC's SGIS, the agency expressed serious concerns about this DEC's casual attitude toward radiation. In comment after comment, they chastised the DEC for not showing the proper concern for handling of radioactive material. At one point, the EPA expressed amazement at a DEC report in which 2 workers reported that there was no sign of the radioactive brine that had been spread on a county road for many years. Apparently, neither the workers or the DEC realized that the real question was, where did the radiation go? As part of our educational effort regarding fracking, Grassroots commissioned and published a report from Ivan White, a staff scientist at the National Council on Radiation Protection, an expert in determining radionuclide transport pathways in the atmosphere's surface water, groundwater, and soil. National Council on Radiation is a congressionally chartered agency charged with authority and responsibility to coordinate public information on radiation protection and radiation measurements. His conclusion was simple and stark. Under the linear, no threshold hypothesis used in radiation protection, the goal is to limit the total radiation dose to large populations because of the increased probability of health effects. The uncontrolled release of hazardous radioactive waste could result in the exposure of millions of people over decades, as it will remain active and potentially lethal and bioaccumulate in the food chain. The New York State DEC has not proposed sufficient regulations for monitoring potential pathways or to even know what is being released into the environment. I commend Assemblyman Sweeney, Assemblyman Gottfried, and Assemblyman Levine for your call to suspend the public comment period for the proposed revised regulations until the state discloses all of its studies and analyses of fracking as has been demanded by a FOIL request and the health impact review has been published. The complete Ivan White report is available on our website, and of course it has also been included as part of this testimony. I urge you to review it in its entirety to fully understand the urgency of addressing this radiation issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stelling.
Let's borrow this. Good evening. My name is Joseph Stelling, and I am with NYPIRG, the New York Public Interest Research Group. NYPIRG was founded in 1973, and we are the state's largest nonpartisan student-directed research and advocacy organization. We focus on a number of areas, including environmental preservation, consumer protection, government accountability and transparency, and social justice. Thank you for taking the time to hold this hearing and take our testimony on such an important issue. High-volume horizontal hydrofracturing in the Marcellus Shale and other low-permeability gas reservoirs carries a potentially huge public health and environmental price tag that we must not ignore. It is evident that New Yorkers are concerned about fracking by the sheer volume of the comments the DEC has received on the draft SGIS and proposed regulations. Rather than consider what the impacts of fracking may be to New Yorkers, these documents ignore critical issues and fail to fulfill the requirements of Executive Order 41, which called for further environmental review than had been conducted for the first flawed draft SGIS. NYPIRG, along with many other organizations, joined with medical and public health experts asking Governor Cuomo for a comprehensive and independent assessment of the public health impacts from fracking. But DEC Commissioner Joe Martens rejected calls for an independent assessment and instead asked a fellow state agency, the Department of Health, albeit with the assistance of outside experts, to assess DEC's public health review, although it remains unclear whether the outside experts were assessing DEC's review or the Department of Health's review of DEC's review. As you know, it's been a secretive process. Certainly falls far short of what the public needs. Now, further, the New York Times revealed the DEC's behind closed doors health impacts assessment of anticipated health effects from fracking 8 days ago, on January 3rd. And the 8-page assessment, which states that adverse health effects will be unlikely, below levels of significant concern, or will otherwise be adequately addressed by mitigation, contains no real analysis, no discernible data, and no real estimates of the illness, disease, deaths, and environmental risks of fracking over time. And so, you know, that's the first part of it. We've talked a little bit about that, but, you know, the second major part, an important comment on these regulations, is that defying basic logic and really contrary to the spirit of the environmental review process, the DEC has already issued the proposed regs on which we're commenting when the environmental review, the SGICE, is not yet finished. Even their own limited health impacts assessment, which is not a real health impacts assessment, an independent assessment, is not finished. And yet here we are with tomorrow's deadline to comment on the proposed regulations. The proposed regs contain one set of regulations for fracking and another set for other types of drilling, and they apply to all shale formations other than the Marcellus shale, even though only the Marcellus was actually looked at in the revised draft SGICE. And so there are many other problems with the proposed regulations, including the fact that there's no ban on dangerous chemicals and the fact that their identities can be kept secret from the public. You know, the DEC merely asked that the chemicals used exhibit reduced aquatic toxicity and pose at least as low a potential risk to water resources and the environment as the available alternatives. But the industry is allowed to keep the public in the dark by claiming trade secrets, so we really won't know what's going on underneath our feet and what kinds of chemicals are being pumped down there. We've heard this already, but you know, it bears reiterating the setbacks, which are the distances from the drilling pads, are weak and they're arbitrary. The proposed regulations allow gas wells 500 feet from an inhabited dwelling or place of assembly. But there's no scientific basis to say that this buffer provides safety. Air pollutants from drill rigs like benzene can travel much farther than 500 feet, as studies from Colorado show. Now, school playgrounds may not even qualify as places of assembly, and therefore would not be covered by the 500-foot buffer rule. And that's a scary thought. Drinking water is not protected. Primary aquifers, which provide drinking water to major municipalities, have a drilling setback of 500 feet, again, inadequate. But smaller aquifers are not protected at all, and no consideration is given to natural underground faults, which can act as pathways for chemical migration, and monitoring wells are not required. Also, we've heard a little bit about the drilling waste issue and the fact that there's no real plan for this toxic wastewater. And in fact, a recent article, I think it was published in August in the Journal of Risk Assessment, found that the wastewater and failure to properly handle that poses the #1 risk for contamination. And that's, you know, completely left unaddressed, essentially. And along the same lines, dangerous radiation is not adequately addressed, as we've heard. Our shale bedrock is highly radioactive, and companies are required to test for the radiation, but not prevent its release. And radon levels in frack gas are many times higher than in conventional gas and can enter homes and apartments while cooking with gas stoves and ovens. And we already mentioned the issue of the wastewater, which also is highly radioactive, and we don't have a good plan to protect the public from that. So NYPIRG urges Governor Cuomo not to ignore his promises of open government and a careful, thorough, independent environmental and health impact review. New Yorkers cannot afford the risk. So I want to thank you again for providing me the opportunity to testify before you today, and NYPIRG especially thanks and commends Chairs Sweeney, Gottfried, and Levine for their call on the administration to suspend the public comment period for the proposed regulations until the state discloses all of its studies and analyses of fracking and the health impact review is complete and published. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Next is Robert H. Boyle.